Minasan konnichiwa. Hello, everyone. I will be speaking Japanese now. Let me follow on the introduction that was just given to me. I am the producer of the Silent Hill series, and I'm also the sound director for the Silent Hill titles. Today, I would like to talk to you about this title, Silent Hill. This is true for all of the series of Silent Hill, but I would also like to talk about the genre of horror as well. For game design and sound design, I have decided to give the title, The Day and Night of Silent Hill. Now, I'm not going to be talking about the low polygon expression using normal mapping or high dynamic range rendering and that type of a technical talk. I'm sure that will be a little boring for you. So I look forward to, I hope that you'll enjoy my talk. Now, looking at horror, I will be talking about various things about my thoughts about horror. So let me go back to my self-introduction and talk about myself a little bit. I have been involved in Silent Hill as a sound creator, and I have been working in this field for about 10 years or 11 years, wanting to be part of music in the game industry. At that time, it was during the Super NES time. That was the time when we didn't have any impressive hardware back then like we have today. So when creating sound, we had to try to create what we can using limited memory allocation as well as limited notes. It's not the time where we can create everything from CD and reproduce everything. So I have seen this evolution. But even in that time period, I have been able to work on creation, and I feel very honored and a great joy at having been able to do that. Then let's start with day. As a producer, let me talk about what I have been doing in Silent Hill, aside from just the sound part. And here, I have written horror Japanese style. But Silent Hill is a game that is not really a Japanese horror game, but I think it can be a starting point for talking about Japanese-style horror games. Those of you who do not know Silent Hill, a lot of American modern horror products such as David Lynch and Stephen King have really influenced us. So we wanted to create something that was similar to that and started off with Silent Hill. Now, I have written Japanese style here, but I and the rest of my staff are Japanese. So for us to create an American modern horror product may be something unusual. And when I was thinking about what to talk about at today's session, I started reflecting on what the Japanese style horror was. Now, I'm not an American, so although I have had some access to American horror through movies and books, but because we're Japanese, even though we aim to make an American-style horror, I think there might be some part of the essence of our games that are really Japanese. It's not something we're doing consciously. But although we are aiming at an American-style horror, because of our culture and where we have been growing up, I think what we naturally feel is fearful or scary may be a little different. And that's why I call this Japanese style. Although we aim to create an American-style horror, we might have a Japanese horror type that is very rooted in the culture. And perhaps Silent Hill is a mixture of this. Although we did not do this in a calculated manner, I think aiming at this American style, I think we might actually have an essence, Japanese essence, that is in Silent Hill. And this type of a dynamic, this type of attention, I think, is something that is extremely enjoyable in my work. You just saw Silent Hill 4. I will talk about this a little later, too. But in this piece, we have a very distinctive concept in Japan, which is this concept of being haunted. Somebody who was killed will come back to this world in order to try to revenge or to take their vengeance out on somebody. I actually tried talking about this before in the past and found it very difficult to explain it in English. So we have this sense of haunting and other elements that are very specific to Japan, I think. So I will be talking about these. In order to be able to understand this better, I wrote here Japanese-style horror and Hollywood-style horror, and I just wrote Hollywood to make it clear. But I wanted to highlight the differences between these two. The Japanese horror, this sense of haunting somebody, as I mentioned earlier, also has other elements as well. This Japanese horror tends to have other things such as unseeable enemy as well. This is true for Silent Hill as well, but we're very concerned about the storyline. And this actually might be really something that's very Japanese. I think in recent American movies like The Sixth Sense and the others also have this very sad, tragic storylines. So having this sad storyline as a base, as a foundation, tends to be very common among Japanese horrors. It's not just a question of surprising somebody or using shocking images, but it's really having a sad storyline that will make somebody want to cry or have some kind of unsettling story. This type of thing tends to be very common. And although we don't really focus on the story necessarily, I think this tends to be characteristic of Japanese-style horror. And perhaps this is not a direct comparison, but in the Hollywood-style horror, we'll have evil spirits, we'll have zombies and shocking visuals. I think putting these up may make it easier to see what Japanese-style horror is like. When we think about how to create these Japanese-style horror pieces, which I'm asked actually a lot, in Japan, we have this concept of a lecture or a sort of a storytelling where somebody from the Edo period, it's a tradition from the Edo period where people will tell these stories, a sad story or history. And this type of art form existed from the past. Perhaps this element also exists in Silent Hill. There is a sense of wetness, which is perhaps doesn't translate well in English, but the sense of sadness, sense of emotion that tends to permeate in a lot of Japanese-style horror. In that sense, Silent Hill encompasses these type of things at its essence. I wrote a chart to make it clear. We have irrational insanity, distorted world, creatures, and mist and darkness. These type of details are used in order to create the game. Silent Hill focuses very much on storyline, as I said. However, but it also has to convey a sense of fear when one plays a game. Otherwise, it will lose its meaning. Silent Hill tends to be focused on the storyline, as I've been repeating, is probably very unique to Silent Hill. I mentioned earlier that there are various elements that go into creating the sense of horror in Silent Hill. But in all four of the Silent Hill series, there was always something that existed as a concept. And there's something that we have always done consciously. Let me talk about these three concepts. The first concept of horror is story, as I mentioned before. Silent Hill, you might already play with, has unclear story. Users, the players might feel this story is unclear. Sometimes it's not user-friendly. I feel a little bit bad about it. But it doesn't have a reasonable story development. With that, the player feel unease because it's not clear, so that the player starts developing a story by himself. By doing that, it provokes a sense of fear. Silent Hill also doesn't say this is a good deed, this is a bad deed. The Silent Hill 4, they received a letter. A person received a letter from a wife who was supposed to be dead, and he saw a lot of creatures representing his guilt. At Silent Hill 2, our theme is crime and punishment. A hero received a letter from a wife who was supposed to be dead. The hero actually killed his wife. He was going to the town hoping that his punishment he would be punished for his murder. And his fear is coming as a form of monsters. He knew he killed his wife. He knew that, but he pretended not to know it. But he received the letter so that he was heading for the hill. That is the destruction of identity. It's a very philosophical storyline. It's hard to grasp the entire picture. But that unclearness fans a sense of fear so that people love it. Unclear story has a lot of details. Due to the details, users could feel many things. In addition to a core story, the player can imagine what's going on. He can interpret the storyline in a way that he wanted to, so that the story had some kind of wetness, wet with tears. That is a unique story development of Silent Hill. The second concept is uneasiness and horror. Sometimes when you are not familiar, you feel scared. Sometimes what you feel uncomfortable will lead to fear. For example, when you are a place where you are not familiar with, then you might have some kind of anxiety. Or if you are somebody who you do not know well and you do not know what he's thinking, you might feel uncomfortable. You have that kind of fear. In Silent Hill, we describe the character of each hero or heroine and other characters. But we don't say this person is a bad person. Every person in the character has multifaceted personality, and I show that in a graph. When you do not know well, you feel uncomfortable. Human beings tend to have imagination. If you do not know something, you try to read the lines in between. You try to fill the gap that which you do not know. So you will start having a logical reconstruction through perception, so that you try to put together fragmented information and creating space for imagination. So the player will use the details to create the story. I think that part would be a good part that we can take advantage of. The creator doesn't need to explain everything. On the other hand, the player tries to develop a story, and we calculate that. With the calculation, we put details in the screen. And with a fragmented information, the user will get some clue. For example, you see some shadow in a snow. We use a lot of fogs or mist in Silent Hill. You feel scared because of poor visibility. And then you thought, oh, that's a person. And then you feel relieved a little bit. And then the object is coming close to you. It turned out that's a psycho killer. So there are two steps of fear. This is one of the concepts of horror that we are using in our games. The next concept is realism and reality. I'm not sure whether I'm using right words in English, but horror is a serious feeling for each person. In contrast, laughing is completely different. The gap, what you think and what other people think, sometimes occurs, and then when you realize the gap, it's really enjoyable. However, the fear is different. What you think and what others think are the same. It's more realistic and you feel scared. I think reality is a very important factor of horror. Using graphics to make objects look like a real thing is completely different, making things look like real. For example, in Silent Hill 3, I take advantage of the movement of eyes. Eyes talk more than mouth. That is Japanese proverb. Eyes show a person's characteristics, and it also tells a lot. Even though you use motion to create or describe the reality, sometimes it's not good enough. If the eyes of a character doesn't tell a lot, it lacks something. So that we used one technique. For example, a person with eyes moving a lot looks uneasy. By looking at person's eyes, you try to see what he is thinking. That's one strategy in our daily life. But in our character setting, each person has multifaceted personality.
When you don't know whether it's a good character or a bad character, I thought perhaps there's something we could do with the eyes. Not just making them look around a lot. Not making their movements a little awkward. And when we were thinking about this, when we were actually drawing up the character, we actually ended up encountering something. It wasn't necessarily a bug. Usually when somebody looks forward, the eyes look straight forward. But because of a bug, one eye was looking just a little bit off, just one side. And then that effect was the sense of making people feel a little uncomfortable that didn't know exactly where they were looking. What is this person looking at? And it wasn't something we did on purpose. Well, we had to look really closely to notice that the focus was actually off. But that was when we realized that eyes really have a lot of power. This realism in reality also means that, for example, we can use computer graphics to make the hair movement look really natural or the leaves move really natural, but that is not what's important. What's more important is what can be conveyed subconsciously. Even if we don't notice it, something is being conveyed through what is shown, and that is reality. And that is also true for our real life. That was something that we wanted to do. As I mentioned, we are trying to use this subconscious mechanism in order to create the sense of horror, and we thought this was very important. Certainly, as far as creating something compelling, creating leaves that really look realistic or hair movement that looks really real, as though it appears in nature, using rendering and computer graphics, are certainly important. That's really photoreality. However, before that, for us, reality means to create emotions among the players and making them feel like they really are there. This also will bring about the sense of fear that is brought on by the subconscious. And so we started thinking about what we can do, what kind of mechanism we can put in order to make that happen. This isn't the only thing we're thinking about, but we certainly thought about that for Silent Hill. Specifically, this is a little bit psychological, but human beings tend to when there are two roads, one goes to the left and one goes to the right, going to the left gives a person a sense of unease, dis-ease. So people actually tend to be more afraid going to the right. So if they're in a forest and they're running, they would tend to go to the left as opposed to the right, because going to the right subconsciously creates fear among people. And that's the same with roller coasters, too. They always turn to the right. Also, there's the difference in ceiling height or floor height that also create the sense of unease within one's psyche. And this was something that we wanted to infuse in the game as well in order to make it more interesting. And for Silent Hill, we used this in order to create a stronger sense of horror in the game. For the next generation machine, we can use normal mapping and polygons and HDR and other things. And so I'm sure the images will become much more closer to reality. It will be photorealistic. However, as we design games, we want to include mechanism that will make the users feel like it's real. This is something that, of course, we value in Silent Hill, but that is an aspect that I think is very valuable and very important for us. I will talk about a few of these points in a summary later on, but I'm going to suddenly jump to the next part. First of all, I talked about the sense of horror game that I have been looking at as a producer. But next, going to the night portion, I would like to talk a little bit about Silent Hill from the perspective of sound. I'm a sound creator and sound director. Basically, I'm not necessarily dividing up my two works as a sound producer as well as the producer. I don't separate those out very much. I wrote here, building the atmosphere, but music and sound effect are not really what I'm trying to talk about. Actually, what I'd like to talk about is how I view these from the production, from the perspective of a producer. First of all, the sense of atmosphere. Although this is not true about all games necessarily, but I think sound in games tend to be very fragmented. And so I think about that as I look at Sound Hill. We can't look only at sound or only at the game, but we have to create an atmosphere. And the sound is information that comes from the ears. So I thought about what to do, what kind of effect I can create as information that comes from the ear. Whether that's music, whether that's sound effect, whether that is the actual dialogue, all of these need to be used for dramatic effect as information that comes in through the ears. So as a sound creator and as a producer, that is what I'm trying to encourage. Silent Hill really doesn't have what we would normally think of music. But even in reality, if something scary happens to you, it doesn't necessarily mean you're going to hear dramatic, scary music. Or if you have a romantic moment, you're not going to necessarily have romantic music playing in the background. So music and sound effect should be used perhaps in a way to enhance drama as opposed to a way that it had been done in the past. So that is what I'm thinking about when I work on sound. Horror games are actually conducive for sound effect and music. However, I try not to divide up music from sound effects myself. This is related to what I mentioned earlier about having sort of the subconscious mechanism. I don't want to necessarily tell the players, okay, now you can not worry, you're fine, or now here comes a scary scene, or something like that. In fact, I'd like to use it as a mechanism to try to provoke people's reaction. And in order to do that, we decided to do a radio. Normally, when a monster appears, one would hear scary music or hear some kind of sound that would bring about this sense of fear. However, in Silent Hill, when an enemy approaches, the radio static noise will be heard. And when the enemy comes closer, the closer the enemy comes, the louder the sound becomes. In reality, when we hear that type of static noise, we're not necessarily afraid. That doesn't necessarily mean it's connected to fear. However, in Silent Hill, the noise from the radio is tied in directly to the enemy and to fear. So, although I shouldn't necessarily say this is a subconscious connection, but we are making the players feel fear when they hear radio. So this is the type of effect that we're doing. And we're also not playing any type of music, and we have basically ambient noise, we might have bat noise, and other things. Music tends to be explanatory. It tends to be romantic, or scary, or fighting, or something that really explains what the other side should be feeling. In games, tends to be that way in explaining how the other should be feeling. But for Silent Hill, I felt that I wanted to try to eliminate as much of music and that type of music as possible. As I mentioned, looking at sound design, not necessarily at Silent Hill, the radio noise is the enemy equals enemy, and therefore used as a way to, as an effect in order to create a sense of fear. In the next generation, we'll have surround sound, and we'll have also multi-streaming. The time it takes to load and the limitation for hardware and other types of limitations will be resolved in the future. So I think a lot more can be done in the future. Although the hardware might advance, but if the creators think of music as music, sound effect as sound effect, and they're different, then it won't be possible to create something new. As a person who's trying to create a new content, something new, I think we might be able to look forward to some of these new technologies that will be coming up. Game sound from the past had been created with the limitations of the hardware, such as the memory allocation and others, and had to be created within these type of limitations. However, as hardware improved and the memory capacity increased and the quality increased, what was possible became, there was much more that was possible. And a lot of effects can be done. However, it seems as though those who are creating software are not necessarily trying anything new. So I would like to hope that in the next generation, using the next generation technology, we might be able to try something that is completely new. I don't have it written game here. I wrote interactive media, but there are several points that I would like to talk about that later on. Silent Hill is not necessarily only a puzzle-solving game. It tends to focus on the story and also tries to convey the sense of fear to the player. And we were trying to have the users feel a different kind of feeling, experience something that is very different. And the reason why I wrote interactive media is because as the hardware improves and the technology improves, such as a lot of the topics that I mentioned in the GDC here today, what we call game may change. It might become more of an interactive media, a new type of content, besides just what we think of as game. We would like to create something like that as well, and we have a few projects in mind.
In the next generation, actually we are creating a horror genre, and as a game creator, we have a team, but they are not a team for horror game. They are trying to create a next generation game. By doing that, we can achieve what we would like to do. And actually, I'd like to specifically talk about what we'd like to do in the future. First is a metaphor. The printing culture, such as literature or novels, are very popular. In addition to that, we have music and poems. For example, we have a metaphor, white skin like snow. It's hard to show that in a video. Even though we show snow and white skin, it doesn't say this is a white skin like white snow. It's impossible to tell that, but by using interactive media, maybe we are able to use a metaphor in a game. White skin like snow. Metaphor, which is widely used in literature, can be also used an interactive media game. We do not try to incorporate printing culture into a game, but we can use photorealistic
technique. And maybe if you just show object as if it looks alike, maybe that's not enough. We have to use some kind of metaphor like expression. The advantage of metaphor is that skin as white as snow gives you a lot of various different impressions or imagination to you. With that metaphor, the player can come up with some concept or imagine something else than we expected. It's very close to imagination. As I mentioned a little bit in terms of reality, if we describe hair photorealistically or leaves falling photorealistically, what will be so important? Instead, we would like to create something makes the player think about something else, like a metaphor. We'd like to create that kind of media or game. We would like to have a different approach to content. That's what we would like to do in the future. Finally, we'd like to create content that shake five senses of human being, which is very close to a metaphor. Game is visual and auditory information. Maybe controller might shake so that you can have touch of feel. But in Japan, the music industry in Japan, maybe in the world, tend to be shrinking. Of course, the outside concert is still very popular. If you can feel the music with five senses, you might enjoy it. They are starving for that, so that in a game, you can hear a music and see objects through a monitor, but also we'd like to provide something that the player proactively do something different from literature and different from movie. We'd like to create something which shake five senses of human being. Graphs technology was used 2 years and 3 years ago to describe objects in real time. By using that technology or others, we'd like to create some content to shake five senses of the person. Also, we'd like to use subconscious mechanism. Sometimes people talk about the reality. However, we would like to create something makes the player feel something subconsciously, and the player feels really scary because of his imagination. We'd like to create that kind of content in the future. With this, I'd like to conclude my talk. Thank you for your kind attention today. If there is a question, please feel free to come up with a microphone and ask questions.
So we're going to open the floor to a couple questions. If you want to come up to the mic, and we'll translate it at the front. Thanks again for attending the talk.
Hi. We've heard that there's a movie in the works for the Silent Hill concept. Are you going to be involved with that? And if so, is it going to be more of a Japanese horror movie or American style horror movie? And what are some of the concepts that you're going to possibly bring from the game into the movie?
It's not a Japanese style horror movie. It's probably pretty close to what the game is actually, what it's like in the game.
Okay, please continue.
Okay, sure.
My name is David Chan. First, I'd like to thank you for the Silent Hill games. Actually, I didn't really even know about the survival horror genre until I played Silent Hill 2, and now it's one of my favorite games of all time. I really love it. And you brought up the radio, and when I was playing the game, I was really curious how you came up with that idea, because it worked on such a visceral level. It got to the point where I couldn't play the game in the dark, because as soon as I heard the radio sound, my heart would just start beating really fast. So I'd like to know how you came up with that idea.
As far as the radio is concerned, in the 80s, industrial music was pretty popular. And this included sound from factories, industrial noise that was used, and music was created using this industrial sound. I personally really like this kind of music, and so I thought it might be interesting if I can use radios like you mentioned, or other type of industrial sound that you would see in a construction site. And so I sampled all of this and decided to use that. So that is how I started.
Thank you.
First of all, I just want to congratulate you, or thank you actually. I've been a big proponent of the idea that there is more than just games with the technology that we have, that there's interaction. That said, I was just curious as to know how you were able to test these games, and did you kind of freak out your testers per se, or and how were you able to gauge the fear after having played it over and over and over again?
Wow. Whenever I have an interview, every time I have a chance to talk to somebody, I'm asked this question. Well, basically, although this is true for horror games, but the horror genre, but as far as game is concerned, I wanted to try something that others weren't doing. I wanted to create some kind of content that nobody had seen and nobody had done before. So that was probably at the background. And on top of that, it would have been nice if I could have created something that would be acceptable by the mass market. But what we're doing tends to be a little bit more niche-oriented. So trying to balance this horror product and the mass market is something I'm trying to balance out all the time in the creation. However, the team staff, the designer program, and everybody were not necessarily thinking about all of this. And in a sense, perhaps there's something wrong with my staff, the fact that this might be too scary.
Hello. Thank you once again for Silent Hill. It's one of my favorite games. Something, with the exception of what's outside your window in Silent Hill 4, everything always has this concept of emptiness. Nobody's there. Or even when you cross over to the other side, everything's just a shadow of what it was. I was wondering, how does that tie into the fear? Because it's definitely an element for me, but it seemed very purposeful as to make it feel like you're all alone sort of deal.
I think, well, I shouldn't say human society, but people tends to thrive among other peoples. There's a sense of unease when one is left alone, and I think that's true for anybody. As far as the room is concerned, not being able to get out of your room, no matter what you do, I think enhances a sense of fear. And that is because it's not just the fact of not being able to get out, it's not being able to get out no matter what one tries. I think this is actually another sense of fear, not going out but not being able to get out.
In Silent Hill 4, well, actually in the entire series, you work a lot with hiding certain parts of the truth, and it takes a great deal of skill to keep misdirection from creeping into the story. And how do you manage not lying to the player but not telling them the whole truth?
Among the basic concept, I mentioned this earlier, but hiding the truth is one element. Actually, we're not necessarily hiding the truth. Among the details that are there, the truth is actually there. However, it's not necessarily very clear. But whether it's in the wrong direction or the true direction, it's something that the player will learn while playing at various times. I don't get this. I'm going to try this again. I didn't get this again. I'll try it again. That is the way, in reality, people learn. From the staff perspective, there are parts where we thought, oh, this might be a little bit dangerous. They might go to the wrong direction. But I think while we are in the process of doing this various times, we will think, okay, this might be a point that is a little difficult for them to see the clear direction, or this might be a little bit more confusing.
Thanks for Silent Hill. Great series, but I noticed that you're always experiencing another character's fears. I was wondering if, and using universal fears for the games, if you and the team had thought about ways to make the fear in Silent Hill series more personal to the player, perhaps tracking things that they do or things that they tend to avoid and using that against them?
Personal fear. I think the sense of personal fear depends on the individual. One person might find something fearful, another might not. So I think there are quite a few, I think it's quite diversified. So I think as far as a drama or having dramatic impact is concerned in creating a horror genre, it's easier to create a sort of a universal fear, and I think it's also easier for games as well. It's easier to create a sort of a universal fear, and I think it's also easier for games as well. It's easier to create a sort of a universal fear, and I think it's also easier for games as well. It's easier to create a